Hi, I'm Space Kate and welcome to Need to Know Space. If you haven't already, please do click and subscribe. It's good to have you with us. Now, I'm going to try something a little bit different with this video. I'm not scripting anything, I'm just going to have a chat with you, because I think it's time we did have a little talk about Starliner. Yes, headlines all over the place, astronauts stranded in space! And this week we discovered that NASA were actually contemplating bringing them home on the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft. But note, that's just an option. It's being considered at the moment as a contingency plan, but it is a way to bring them home from space, so my point still stands, they're not actually stranded. Now, if you are new to this story, well, what planet have you been on, frankly? But this is the gist. When the space shuttle was retired, there was a gap. The US was unable to send humans to space, to the International Space Station, on a vehicle from their own soil, from their own launch pads, and their own American-built rocket. They had to rely on the Russian Soyuz, which is a very stable workhorse of a rocket that is still being used today to take cosmonauts and, in fact, astronauts up to the International Space Station. Even American astronauts, because they have a seat swap arrangement with Russia to help even out the crews on the International Space Station. NASA asked commercial companies to come up with ideas to see if they could provide a commercial crew alternative. They didn't want to spend all their money creating another vehicle that could get them to low Earth orbit. NASA already knew it could do that, and NASA's about exploring, pushing the boundaries, and seeing what else is out there. So it didn't make sense for them to spend their money doing that again. They already had the space shuttle, done. Now, the two companies that were eventually selected to create these crew transport programs were SpaceX, and they have now for about 4 years been successfully flying operational flights, taking astronauts up to the International Space Station and bringing them back down again. And they splash down in the ocean where the capsule and the astronauts are recovered. The second company was Boeing, and they were producing an entirely new spacecraft, and they actually produced the only US space capsule that is due to touch down on land rather than splash down in the ocean. Okay, so far so good. Well, okay, Boeing had a few issues on their original flight tests. There were a number of tests they needed to do and get ticked off by NASA before they were allowed to put astronauts on the vehicle, which makes sense. And unfortunately, in their orbital flight test 1, they had some mission critical issues, which meant they weren't actually able to make it to the International Space Station. They had to repeat the test, orbital flight test 2, and then once NASA was happy and signed off on it, they followed up with the crewed flight test, which is currently taking shape right now, with Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, both very experienced astronauts and test pilots in their own right, and they are the test pilots of the crewed flight test 1 for Boeing. This finally got round to launching on the 5th of June earlier this year, and you may have heard some stories that the mission was only supposed to be a couple of days, or it was only supposed to be a week. I'm afraid that's not really true. I actually had to correct a news programme I was speaking on yesterday because they kept saying, oh, they're only supposed to be there for a couple of days and then come home, and now it might be months. Well, technically they had to be there for at least 8 days in order to get the certification that they required for the vehicle to carry astronauts in future as an operational vehicle for NASA and to fulfil their contract. So it was always going to be at least 8 days. But it was never actually a determined length mission. It wasn't, we're definitely doing 8 days and we're coming back on this day. No, it's a test flight. Why would you limit yourself like that? So the idea of this flight was to test it, make sure it could dock safely with the International Space Station, see how it worked with the station, how it could be used by more than 2 astronauts as a kind of lifeboat in space if there was orbital debris coming nearby. So there were various checks and things they wanted to do while they were in space. Now, we know that the vehicle had some issues on the way to the space station. In fact, one of them, they even found it before it launched, but it was deemed that it was fine to fly with it, and that was a helium leak. Since they got into space, they've actually sprung several more of those leaks, and so there was some work to be done to work out why that was happening and if it would cause any issue with the return of the crew on the vehicle. In addition, as they were approaching the International Space Station and testing out the thrusters, they had an issue with actually quite a few of them. 5 thrusters, in fact, all on the aft section, but after doing a hot refire, they managed to get 4 of those back online. The 5th one, they decided to go on ahead without it, and because they build in redundancies, because you need to make sure you've got a backup if something doesn't work when you're in space, they were absolutely fine and were given the go-ahead to go and dock with the International Space Station. So, NASA, of course, and Boeing wanted to know what it was that had caused these problems, and so they started doing tests. Some of those tests they were doing in space, and some of the tests they wanted to do on the ground to see if they could repeat what had happened in space on the way up to the station and find out why that was affecting the thrusters in the way that it had. So they've been doing all sorts of tests for many, many weeks, and that is what has been delaying the return of the mission. NASA wants to ensure that they know exactly what the root cause of everything is, so that they can deem whether it is safe enough to bring Butch and Suni home on Starliner. Now, all these tests appear to have been going quite well and have shown quite a few interesting things. So they've had an issue with the thrusters, which could be due to overheating. They've gone on to say that it could be to do with a particular valve seal called a poppet valve. And one of the interesting things they were finding was that when that was getting overheated, it was causing it to extrude and actually starting to block some of the fuel into the thruster. And so that was causing a degraded thrust performance. Also, as it was getting hot, some of the fuel was vaporizing. Not a good thing. But they were able to try and work out, and they believe that they found the root cause for that, or Boeing at least believes they found the root cause of that. Since they've been up on station, they've actually done a repeated hot fire test, so they've fired all of those engines, except the one that they've decided isn't worth trying with, and they seem to have regained near nominal, near perfect functionality again. So that indicates that whatever this little seal that had kind of become overstretched and blocked the fuel, it was no longer doing that. Now, the reason that NASA is kind of really interested in this is they just don't understand why it's doing that. Why would a Teflon seal react that way? What is the physics of it? And they really, really want to understand what is going on there, because it's not something that they've seen before. With the helium leaks, Boeing have identified that it may be an issue with the seal, and that's something that on future flights they will be dealing with. They will replace that seal and retest it, and retest it, and retest it, I'm sure, before they put it on any other future vehicles. So, they've done all this work, things seem to be looking good. We kept hearing messages that they were all very confident that they could bring home Butch and Suni on Starliner, and that was their primary option. So what changed this week? Well, this week we had a press conference from NASA which for the first time didn't include anybody, any representative of Boeing, which was a bit of an interesting change to things. And I think the key takeaway that I took from that was that NASA was now openly talking about contingency plans for bringing Suni and Butch home via a different method than Starliner. Now, that is not to say that any decision has been made. In fact, as of now, no decision has been made, but it means that they are openly exploring it as an option. And why are they admitting to that now rather than earlier? Well, it seems as though the testing, rather than giving them more confidence in bringing the astronauts back on Starliner, because it gave new questions that they haven't got the answers for, made some people feel a little bit uncomfortable about it. Because if you don't understand it fully, does that mean you don't know what could happen? You know, is there a situation which you haven't got in your simulations because you don't know how this material is reacting in certain physical ways? And that's what it seems to be the sticking point here. Now, last week, Boeing put out a blog post saying that they had full confidence in the vehicle, listing all the many, many different tests they've done, both in space and on the ground, and they are fully confident, they say, that the vehicle could safely bring home Butch and Suni. NASA is still happy for Butch and Suni to use the vehicle to return to Earth if there was an emergency. So nothing has really changed, except the fact that we haven't gone through the return readiness review. So this is the kind of bit of bureaucratic, important decision making where they bring all of the experts, all the data, they look through it and they make sure that they understand absolutely everything about every system before they give the go to return on the vehicle. It seems that in some of the program control board meetings, which come ahead of that review meeting, there has been a bit of dissent. So that means there's been disagreements between Boeing and NASA. Boeing, as I said, seemed very confident that they could bring Butch and Suni home in their vehicle and complete the flight test as planned. NASA, on the other hand, doesn't seem quite so convinced. Now, we heard in the press conference that Ken Bowersox, who is an associate director at NASA, he was saying that it was a very healthy discussion to have, that many voices were heard, that this is exactly how the decision-making process is supposed to work. You should be able to question things, you should be able to challenge things, and make sure that you are absolutely certain. One of the other things he said was that a right-minded person could argue in either direction. They could argue it's not worth the risk and we shouldn't bring them home on Starliner, or you could equally be, of sound mind and say, no, this is totally fine, we should bring them back on Starliner. I think perhaps one of the issues, and this is probably a real big problem, certainly for Boeing, is that one, NASA of course wants to keep its astronauts safe. Everybody wants to keep the astronauts safe. That is rightly the top priority. Now, I think the difference between when the Crew Dragon had its first flight test, on this occasion, there is an alternative way to bring them home. So even if there was a slight risk with the Dragon 1, because it was a test flight, there was always additional risk in those flights, there wasn't a better option. There was no other option for bringing them back in a different way. Whereas for Starliner, there's something they don't quite understand. It's, by all accounts from Boeing, it should be safe to bring them home in the vehicle, but there is a potential other option. And I suppose if you're a decision maker, you really, really want to understand every single bit of that data, because if you were to make a decision to bring them home in Starliner and there was a problem, and you knew all along there was a potential other solution, how would you live with yourself? And it's very interesting how the decision-making process works. It's a very well-ordered process. At the end of the day, it's the NASA administrator who has the final say, but the administrator sort of delegates down, gives the responsibility for these big decisions to the experts in their field in the different departments. So currently, at the level of Ken Bowersox, he would be the person that would chair the readiness review, and if there was any dissent and they couldn't come to an agreement on it, and that does seem to be the case at the moment, it would then get taken up to the next level, which would be the associate administrators of NASA, and then finally, if they can't make a decision and feel happy with it, it will go up to Bill Nelson, the administrator of NASA, to make that final decision. NASA have apparently flown in some extra experts, so they've brought new people in on to have a look at all of the data there, so they're really, really going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. So, what happens if they decide not to bring Butch and Suni back on Starliner? Well, this raises a couple of things that we have to think about. First of all, how do you get the capsule itself home safely? Can it fly without a crew? Well, the answer to that is, of course, yes. We know that it can fly without a crew because on those first 2 orbital flight tests that it did, that's exactly what it had to do. The issue now is that because there was a crew, the software has been programmed in such a way that when they're undocking, if there were any issue that occurred, the crew would have a chance to intervene in the system and make a decision about what to do. So they just need to reconfigure that software to take out the astronaut input, if you like, so that they could do an uncrewed docking of the Starliner capsule if that's what they end up deciding to do. And they do need to take Starliner away and undock it from the space station because there are only 2 ports on the International Space Station for visiting crew vehicles from the US, and there's already Crew 8's Dragon capsule is docked to one, Starliner is docked to the other, and the next crew, Crew 9, is due to fly, well in fact they were due to fly in August, but that mission has now been delayed to buy them more time to look through the data. So, what would happen if Starliner comes back uncrewed, well, that means, in fact, for the first time ever, I think technically you could say that Butch and Suni would be stranded just for a few days, or however long it takes them to get the Crew Dragon capsule up there, but technically you would have more people on the International Space Station than you have seats that you know would safely bring them home. And I don't think there's ever been a time in International Space Station history, that that has been the case. I think that's quite interesting and actually potentially quite risky. It's very unlikely, but not impossible, that something catastrophic could happen to the International Space Station. Now, we know that they could use the Crew Dragon as a lifeboat. They could stay in there and remain sort of protected if need be, if there was some orbital debris coming by. But would they actually be able to come home with 6 people in a Crew Dragon capsule? It doesn't seem certain, and if they had to, it would be a bit of a makeshift, almost Apollo 13 style, build it out of what we've got thing, to build some cot bed seats out of foam for Butch and Suni. And I'm not sure, personally, as an astronaut, I would want to return to Earth like that, because there's a reason that they mould these things to you and train you and have the correct flight suits for you, because the Boeing flight suit won't connect to the SpaceX Dragon. And no SpaceX spacesuits have been sent up there for Butch and Suni on the most recent cargo ship, which was the Northrop Grumman Cygnus, which arrived just also this week. It's been quite busy up on Space Station. So that is kind of an intriguing prospect that they're looking at that. But the plan would then be to fly the Crew 9 Dragon up to the space station, but instead of it having the full crew of 4 people who are already set and ready to fly to space, they would only fly 2 people up. And what they would have to do is put in some weight, some ballast into the other 2 empty seats to make sure that its centre of gravity was still in line with what it should be, and they could then take that up to the space station and bring Butch and Suni home with the Crew 9 team. Except Crew 9 isn't due to return until February 2025. Now remember, Butch and Suni, they launched on the 5th of June 2024. So if they do end up staying, they would become the other half of Crew 9 and would make up that complement of astronauts on the ISS all the way through until February. They are ready and planned. They knew this was a contingency. There are spacesuits on the space station in both of their sizes, so should they need to do a spacewalk while they're there, that's possible. Their training is up to date on avionics, on station maintenance, and they've already been happily helping the crew of the space station conduct all sorts of interesting science while they're there. So it would just be a very long mission for them. It's not the first time that something like this has happened. In fact, it was Sergei Krikalev, at the time, Soviet cosmonaut, who was up on the Mir space station, the Russian space station, until the Soviet Union collapsed. And because of all the unrest on Earth, he was asked to stay up in space for a further 6 months. And I think he did that while he had a very young child, so he missed out on a chunk of them growing up, because there was no way to bring him home without losing the space station, and by the time he came home, the country he left from didn't even exist anymore. So I think he was probably a bit more stranded than Butch and Suni. At least it's a test flight. They knew that it was a possibility. A remote possibility? Sure, but still a possibility. And it's definitely something that NASA is now considering. So we just don't know what's going to happen. It sounds like we will get a decision at some point next week. They did say by mid-August the decision would need to be made so that they can put in place all the plans that they have. They've been planning this all out so that it could happen. Everything is ready in case this needs to happen. We just don't know which of the 2 crew members from Crew 9 would be grounded, because if they do fly with just 2 of the 4, that means 2 of those astronauts, or it could be even a cosmonaut, because there is a Russian due to fly on that mission. We don't know who gets to go and who gets to stay, and what that will actually do for international relations if you bump the cosmonaut. It's quite a tricky position for everyone to be in, so there is definitely a lot of information that needs to be looked at, and a discussion to be had. What's the right answer? I honestly don't know. Boeing are very confident in their vehicle and they believe that it could bring Butch and Suni home safely. But then again, why would you take a risk on something if you're not 100% sure of exactly what every single piece of data is telling you and whether you've got down to the root cause and understood exactly why something's happening? And it seems that NASA is taking the very safety first approach to look through all of the data, really trying to understand that before they come to a decision. I'm really glad that I don't have a decision like that to make. I'm not sure that I could live with the idea of making a decision which could result in the loss of life of anybody. But there is risk in both directions, you know? If they bring Butch and Suni back on Starliner, it would hopefully be fine. But there is, of course, a risk of something unknown unfolding as they descend down to Earth. And we wouldn't want to see that. There again, if they decide to go for the Crew Dragon option, the Crew Dragon is now not even launching until no earlier than the 24th of September. But yeah, if you were to go with that option, it does mean, even just for a brief moment, there would be a point where there isn't really a safe option to bring the astronauts home should there be a catastrophic event occurring with the International Space Station. Now, the odds of that happening are something I guess they're going to be looking at. You know, I'm sure it's a very small chance that the whole station would be destroyed in such a way that the only option would be to return to Earth. But should that happen, I think that Butch and Suni would probably be less safe in makeshift seats in Dragon than they would be in Starliner. So again, it's looking at all the data, trying to work out the risk of this and the risk of that. So a decision I am glad that I don't have to make. I am looking forward to see what they decide. It's been definitely a very interesting period. And yeah, as I say, from this recent press conference, it does seem that there is, I'm not sure it's quite a rift, but there's definitely disagreement between Boeing and NASA. And it's a very interesting situation to be in. So we just wait and see and find out what happens. What decision will they make? Will Butch and Suni come home on Starliner, or will that return uncrewed? And they will join the Crew 9 complement and stay up in space until February 2025. Either way, the thing to remember is this has always been a test flight. These two astronauts are very well experienced test pilots. They know to prepare for every contingency. They know that this was always a potential option. And it seems like they've been having the time of their lives up in space. To be honest, I think there are worse places to be stuck than in space. Frankly, I'd be more upset being stuck in an office. But let's see what happens. Let's not get too overexcited about who said what and what's going on here. Let's just stick to the facts. We don't know whether they're coming home on Dragon or whether they're coming home on Starliner. But the fact that that is now an open question is quite interesting. That's all from me for now. I hope that was in some way useful. It is a tricky situation, trying to explain it, not so easy, but I just thought we'd just sit and have a little chat and let's see what happens. Either way, let's hope that everybody comes home and has soft landings. Until next time!